Salams, this is People's Dispatch, and you're watching the Daily Debrief. It's Saturday, it's our weekend show, and there's actually a lot going on, including developments from Sudan and the United States. In Sudan, fighting is underway between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces. Civilians in the midst of all this are hiding. There have been reports of artillery fire and small arms fire in Khartoum as well as other parts of the city. Prashant of People's Dispatch is in studio with us to talk about that. Following which, we'll be talking about the arrest or the detention of US serviceman Jack Texera for the leaks of classified military documents that have the entire world's eyes on them. And as far as the news cycle is concerned, documents that are highly classified, and many of them pertain to the Russia-Ukraine war. We'll be covering that story with Prabir Kayastha, NewsClick's editor-in-chief. Prashant, good to have you back in the studios with us, even though it's not under anywhere close to the best of circumstances. This is a breaking story, of course. Things are still developing on the ground in Sudan, so we won't talk too much about the events that have taken place, but this much is clear that there is serious fighting going on between the Sudanese army and paramilitaries, the rapid support forces. What are the reports you're getting, first of all, and then the context to this conflict between the two forces?
Right, Siddharth, just to sort of reiterate, like you said, this is, by the time this episode goes out, things might be very, very different over there. So we're not making any predictions about the fighting or, who's in what position. There are a lot of claims and counterclaims that are going on. But I think it's important to talk about the context, which is that, just for some past, we know that in October, there was Omar al-Bashir was the president of Sudan for a very long time. In 2019, in fact, on April 11th, he was overthrown by a very powerful movement which has been called the Sudanese Revolution. The military establishment at that time kind of consolidated its power and then basically took over. There was an alliance with civilians, and in October 2021, we know that the civilian government was overthrown by the very same army. Now, ever for all the past 3-4 years, we've been talking about the RSF, which is, like you said, the Rapid Support Forces. It's a paramilitary force. It is part of the Sudanese security establishment. Now, it is not, at the same time, it's not directly under the control of the Sudanese army, and that has been always a part of the tension that has been there. So for a long time, these forces, they worked very closely together, but over the past few months, as negotiations have been going on for a new government, there have been differences increasingly emerging between the Sudanese army, which is led by the current president of the country, al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, which is led by the second in command of the country. So we have the country's two most powerful people, the army head and the head of the RSF at loggerheads. And one of the key issues has been really the question of what is the status of the RSF itself. So everyone is technically in agreement that the RSF should, not exist per se as an independent force. But there's been a disagreement on what is the way to do it. So the army wants the RSF to be part of the army. It wants the RSF to be integrated into the army as part of a process.
Regularized in that sense.
Right. And they were looking at maybe a 2-year timeline for this process to take place. Now there are conflicting reports. Some reports said the RSF wanted a 10-year integration process. Some reports said the RSF wanted more oversight under the civilian administration as opposed to the army. So there was a lot of differences over these kind of things. Also, a key factor is that there are various foreign players supporting both the army and the RSF. And all this had led to an increase in tension over the past few months. Many media reports had been emerging. And this culminated in the RSF deploying in various parts of Sudan, including the capital Khartoum, over the past few days. And both the army and the RSF kind of basically with guns drawn at each other. Now, there was some talk that there were attempts at a settlement over the past few days, but it seems like those have not worked, at least as of now. As we are shooting, we don't know if this is going to be a brief bit of fighting and there's going to be a call for a ceasefire, or if this will really escalate. But nonetheless, it's a very dangerous time for the people of Sudan because they've already suffered intensely under the coup. We know that people taking to the streets, scores of people have been killed since October 2021. We know that the protesters on the streets have called for an expansion of the Sudanese revolution. They don't want to compromise with the army. They don't want to compromise with the security forces. They don't want a civilian government, which is basically just a patsy for the security forces, which is really how the army envisaged it. That is what the army wanted. They wanted a civilian phase, but they wanted to keep control of the key aspects of the economy, including the security forces. So they did not want civilian oversight over the security forces, right? And the protesters on the streets have been calling precisely for that. They want the army and the security forces to be under civilian command, which is a key element to any functioning democracy. So that's really where we are at right now. So this, in some senses, is a very dangerous, track as far as Sudan is concerned, because we already have the negotiations taking place over the future of the country, and these negotiations itself are very problematic, because there was always the risk that they would just be formality, and they would not mark any radical transition to civilian power. And now we have this conflict between two very well armed and very powerful wings of the military or the security forces, which can only cause more chaos. Very important to remember that the rapid support forces are not just any paramilitary forces. They have a long record of brutal violence in the Darfur regions. They are invested in the economy of that regions, in mining, in extracting minerals. So very, very difficult time for the people of Sudan.
Prashant, so irrespective of what the positions on the ground will be, like you were pointing out, these are two highly militarized groups. One is, of course, an army in itself, with an air force as well, and there are talks of how the paramilitaries are trying to take control of some of those infrastructure as well as equipment and things like that. For the people of Sudan, this obviously means, and like you said, the history of conflict that there is in the region, hundreds of thousands have been killed and displaced. Very real fears of again breaking into some kind of civil war like situation.
Right, and which is why I said that this kind of derails that process, because just to again summarize, after October 2021, like I said, the military, which included the RSF as well, they staged this coup, removed the civilian government. And since that time, for many months, there's been an attempt to hold negotiations under the auspices of various international groups. Now, these negotiations basically were leading to a situation. There was an agreement in December where civilians would once again come back to power. But the forces on the ground which have been driving the protests, they were very unhappy with this. And the main reason was that there was no real sustainable transfer of power and expansion of civilian authority. Because it did look like the army would continue to control the levers of the economy. It did look like the army would still be, pulling the strings from behind, and the civilians would be pretty much the face of the whole thing. So what they had been calling for, in fact, the forces of the left, the Sudanese Communist Party, what are called the neighborhood resistance committees, all of them had actually said that this kind of new transition process that is being envisaged, whereby civilians come to power, is actually quite fake. And they had been calling for actually a much larger democratic process, and they were in fact calling for an intensification of the protests, including maybe even a general strike, which has long been something that the left has been deliberating, where the unions, the popular forces all come together and really push this moment at this point of time. So we have a very imperfect and controversial transition process, and then you have something like this which threatens to reverse it even further. So I think a lot will depend on the coming few hours, the coming few days. Will international players be able to sort of intervene? Because it does look like they are trying to. Will better sense prevail? What will be the strategy of the forces on the ground still remains to be seen. Whether they'll be able to step in as well, very, very big and important question. So, what happens at the end of this, who emerges stronger, who emerges more weaker, is really an important question. And this could, as well, it could go either way. It could be a moment of further crisis. It could also, for all be a moment of opportunity for the popular forces to push their agenda further. So I think we have 3 or 4 very different players, all very much in the center right now. So it really is a very important, this could be a very radical turning point as far as Sudan is concerned.
Right. So we will, of course, like I was saying, continue to cover the situation in Sudan with Prashant as well as the rest of the reporting team at People's Dispatch, and bring you updates next week when we resume our show. But in the meantime, we're moving on to our second and final story of the day, which comes from the United States, where the Federal Bureau of Investigation has arrested, in a quite massive and highly militarized looking operation, a 21-year-old serviceman, US serviceman named Jack Teixeira, for the leaks, the controversial leaks of classified military documents, what are actual military documents and what are just other documents that have been leaked in the process. We do not know yet, but as far as official sources are concerned, Jack Teixeira is the person who is behind many of these leaks. The documents, of course, the most pertinent of them concerning the Russia-Ukraine war that is ongoing at present, and at least according to the Western media, might have widespread impact on the war that is ongoing in Europe. For more on this, we are joined now by Newsclick Editor-in-Chief Prabir Purkayastha to understand firstly how this 21-year-old, and if at all this 21-year-old, could be the sole mastermind of this entire leak process and of course the impact thereof. Prabir, the ongoing story about the leaks of these classified military documents, many of them pertaining to the war in Ukraine, are the biggest story, one of the biggest stories in the world right now. And the reactions have ranged from, of course, very little surprise by US allies that the US military and intelligence establishment is, of course, spying on its friends as much as its adversaries, including the UN Secretary General, who is not surprised at all. But this kid who has been picked up, and is a 21-year-old, of course, he is an American serviceman, but a kid at the end of the day. How are you looking at it? Could Jack Teixeira be the sum of this entire operation to leak these documents, and what could his possible motivation be, given what we know about his history and his desire to serve in the US military and all of that?
Of course, these questions will probably go on for quite a long time. So what we're going to say is only at the moment scratching the surface. Two things I think are important. How is it a 21-year-old guardsman with no seniority have such access to documents which are supposed to be at the general's level, who are looking at the larger picture, the information being given to them, therefore is for certain eyes only. What eyes they are, we don't know, but certainly not the eyes of 21-year-olds, except for the fact there is always a loophole in all these systems, which is who maintains them. And whoever maintains them has got high access. Clearance. And if you have high access, which means you have to have high clearance. So therefore, unfortunately, the 4-star generals who are supposed to see these documents do not maintain the communication network themselves. They also do not probably operate the printers, which prints these documents. So there is a bunch of people who get access to this, providing the support to the high-level generals who need to look at this kind of information. So it's not surprising. He was supposed to be somebody who was supposed to look after the network, which connects all these top secret servers. And therefore, he had high access given. High access means, therefore, he had access also to the information. You cannot check for the integrity of the communications and the service without also having access to the information on it. So he had a high access. Don't forget, Snowden was had root access to the servers, mainly because he was a techie. He was maintaining all the systems. So this guy seems to have been somebody who was of that kind. And therefore, he had a much higher level of access than what his stature would have really warranted. So that's one part. Yes, I think he did have access to relatively highly secret documents, which otherwise most people in the armed services also of the United States would not have access to them. The second question is, of course, that are all the documents which are being leaked today, are they part of the same leak? That is the question which we have no answer to, because it's quite possible a lot of other leaks are taking place to really hide the damaging information by covering up under various other things. Of course, the most innocuous leak in all of this is the fact the US spies on its allies. This we know from the time that Angela Merkel's phone was tapped, to all the negotiations that take place on treaties, for example. We know that NSA use routinely to know what your friends are also thinking about. So all these negotiations, the Americans have a front seat, because they also have the NSA to hack into the whole world. So this is not surprising. Therefore, they were snooping on their friends. And yes, some part of it is embarrassing. no doubt. But the point is, the French know that they are being spied upon all the time. Particularly if Egypt does not know that it is spied upon all the time by its great ally, the United States, it must be living in a fool's paradise. Unlikely to be true. So I think that part of the information, a core part of this information did leak out the way it's being talked about. But Teixeira was the only person, not as a different issue, but certainly it did happen the way it did. And it's also true that he seemed to have had access, which was relatively high level. The second question you ask, that is it the only leak? Are there other things? Are people blowing smoke using this leak? Are they giving news out, claiming it's a part of the leak, which it is not? These are essentially red herrings that is being let loose. All these are open questions, particularly when Eric Toller is one of the key persons who's investigating who is the leaker. He's actually pointing Teixeira out. Apparently, the whole American intelligence agency had no such access. Now, he's from Bellingcat, closely associated with it. And we know Bellingcat essentially is a front operation of the UK, of the United Kingdom, and in close alliance with the US intelligence agencies. So he teamed up with New York Times to really unmask the leaker, and the entire US authorities could not do it, or couldn't do it faster than him, is very, very surprising. But what else is being leaked from those quarters, New York Times and Washington Post, seems to be something which perhaps to me is at the moment disinformation. So the idea is that the United States has lost some information, particularly with respect to Ukraine, the kind of arms that are there, the kind of number of soldiers that they have trained, etc., which probably is something that others also know. It's not that Russia doesn't know, does not have this information. It's not that bad in terms of what they have lost to the Russians. But yes, this is not something they wanted to tell the whole world. Because you could always say Russia is disinformation. This is not true. Ukraine is actually almost on the verge of defeating Russia. So all those they could say. But this does give a picture that the Ukraine army is not doing particularly well. And another 3 to 6 months, they are going to have a very tough time. So this is the picture that emerges. So therefore, the need to now cover this up by saying Russian intelligence is completely leaky, there is all this information we have broken into the Russian intelligence, all this is being planted. Is it true? Let's be very clear about one thing. Both sides know each other's intelligence. Okay, this is supposed to be something which is the best kept intelligence secret in the world, that there's nothing between agencies they don't know of each other, because there is too much of information. You cannot hide your troops' disposition. You have the eyes in the sky. Okay, so you know all of that. Therefore, to say there is huge information leaks taking place from Russia, which they have hacked into, I think those are the red herrings at the moment. But yes, it is true that these things, unless we get the tranche of original documents, which is what we had, for instance, in the various Pentagon Papers kind of leaks, we are not going to be able to see what is what. You see, in the earlier case, Pentagon Papers or the Deep Throat, which took place from the FBI, the leaks that led to Nixon's downfall, these were documents which were verifiable in different ways historically. They did lead to certain changes taking place. These documents that we are talking about now are relatively less difficult to identify at what is the core going to be. But believing Teixeira as the sole master leaker of Snowden variety doesn't seem, as you said, square in with the picture that we have of him. Yes, he had access. Yes, it's possibly 20-year-old, 21-year-old bragging about what he knows. He could have released some of that. But the scale at which these documents are now coming out seems to show this is at the moment trying also to cover up the core leak by leaking a whole lot of other things which are not really the right documents, and they are really manufactured documents, to hide the real documents which might have leaked out, which at least they don't want to keep secret from the Russians. They already know what it is, but they would like to keep it secret from their own people.
And very quickly, if you can, because the mainstream media and particularly the Western media is talking at length about the kind of impact this might have on the war in Ukraine, including, of course, the signs that you're talking about, that the Russians will get bits of information from here that they are not currently aware of, which doesn't seem the case. But what impact do you see it having, if any?
I don't think this is going to make any changes to the Russian plans. Whether the American plans or the NATO's plans would change in Ukraine, that's a different question. Now that this information is out in public domain, if the axis of strikes, etc., are the same as given in these documents, they would prove the veracity of this document. So they might have to rework some of this, mainly to say, well, the damage wasn't that much. That may happen. But, whatever happens today, whatever arms movements, army movements, armed forces movements take place today, you have to assume the eyes in the skies on both sides, monitor every bit of it. So I don't think that you can hide large troop dispositions easily. That's not possible.
All right, fair enough. But we'll leave it there for today. Thanks very much for joining us. And with that also, we bring to a close this week's coverage of the news and, of course, our coverage which takes you beyond the headlines on many of these stories of interest to audiences around the world. You've been watching Daily Debrief. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all of the other work we do. We'll be back with another episode, another week of coverage on Monday. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.